Welcome. Thank you for giving me some of your precious time to talk about accumulating wealth. I believe in the Western world we are entering into a unique time in history, which will be known for a time of abundance and prosperity. My name is Harold Eberly. My wife and I have been ministering for over 45 years. During the last 35 years, I've traveled extensively worldwide, primarily in developing nations. But I speak as a U.S. citizen, a country where it is easier, comparatively, to prosper. Many of the countries that we spend time in, it's difficult because of the economic systems that's been set up by the government. And some governments are corrupt. It keeps the finances away from the common people, and therefore it's very difficult for the average person in those countries to prosper. Some countries that we go to also have a caste system. Now, a caste system usually is seen as levels within a hierarchy, and people are born into a caste system. They are required to find employment that corresponds with that caste system. They must only marry someone within that caste system. Therefore, they're locked into that caste system for generations. One of the only ways for people in those countries to escape is by actually moving to a different country where the expectations of the community are totally different. And then they can live differently and actually move into a different economic level. Here in the United States and other Western countries, we don't usually think about caste. We do have terminology, classes, and we often speak in terms of lower class, middle class, and upper class. And I want to use that framework to lay down a few principles, but then direct our attention to a lesson Jesus taught us about accumulating wealth and three considerations that every person who accumulates wealth needs to keep in mind, needs to give some thought to. So that's what I'd like to do right now, begin doing, talking about the three classes that are most often used in Western developed nations to talk about value systems. See, each of our three classes, lower class, middle class, and upper class, there's a certain value system, a way of thinking associated with each of the classes. Now, that's a very generalized statement. There's volumes and volumes of books written on these different values and different ways of thinking. And it's too easy to oversimplify because people have come from all over the world to the Western world and to developed nations in order to access our economy. And they brought with them their own values, their own ways of thinking. So I can't talk in specific terms. There's countless nuances to what I'm about to say. But generally speaking, there's a lower class, and people within that class have certain ways of thinking, certain values. There's a middle class. People have certain ways of thinking within that class. And there's an upper class, and people have certain ways of thinking. Within this economic system, people can elevate, they can move from one class to the other. They can, through hard work and wisdom, sometimes through opportunities that they didn't expect, elevate to a higher class. But they can also move down. Things happen. Life is complicated. There can be business failures, sickness, tragedies, unlimited number of things that can happen because life is complicated. However, we do in our Western developed society have the ability to be mobile within the classes. It's not easy to change because you have to change your values and your thought patterns also, which I want to talk about. But let me define a little bit about those thoughts and values within each of these classes. Now, starting with the lower class, um, I came from a family lineage that was of the lower class value system. On my father's side, my foreparents migrated from Germany to the United States. On my mother's side, they came from Western Europe, primarily Ireland, and they came to the United States with their values, but they came from very difficult lifestyles. Now, that's one of the key characteristics of the way of thinking of people who have a lower class value system. First of all, they think life is hard. They expect it to be hard. And what you expect somehow has a way of manifesting, revealing itself in your own life. But that a deep expectation that life is hard becomes a limitation on their lives because your belief that life is hard actually limits you to not see how it could be better. And your belief system limits you, even though if you're in that belief system, it's difficult for you to understand this or see a way out. Within the lower class way of thinking, the way of thinking that I was raised with, um, adults typically they have certain expectations about their own lives. They think that they will have to work with manual labor or servant roles or any other specific ways of thinking that did not require great training or great education. They will probably during their lifetime have periods, sometimes extended periods, when there is no work, there is no income. They'll have to rely upon relatives or somehow scrape just to survive. But it's because life is hard, it's just expected that there's going to be difficult times in the mind of lower class people. It's the expectation. Of course, I said I was raised that way. It took me much time, much retraining to think differently and to make the changes, the corresponding changes in my life, so I could at least rise up a little bit into a middle class situation, but still defining the lower class way of thinking. Generally speaking, adults grow up and they have certain expectations on what they owe to their children. Um, in the lower class way of thinking, adults expect that it's their responsibility to meet the needs of their children, but they would think of needs as shelter, clothing, and food. Um, Concerning clothing, clothing probably not all their clothing is going to be brand new. In fact, the majority of their clothing is probably used clothing or hand me down clothing, especially as they're young children. Feeding, the parents think it's their responsibility to meet the needs of the children, but not necessarily should desires be thought about. And there will probably sometimes in their children's lives when they might miss a meal or two. And that's just a part of life. It's an expected thing of the lower class way of thinking that yes, the children, we should eat what's put before them, they should clean their plates, they should appreciate the food they get. Um, Concerning shelter, adults, um, they may hope to someday buy a house, but in reality, if they do buy a house, probably if they live in that house for years, by the end of their life, that house will not have much value, and perhaps it should be better torn down than sold. It's not usually a way of accumulating wealth for the lower class um, because they don't have such long range goals as the upper class and the middle class that we're going to talk about in a minute. One more element of the lower class is there's hope within lower class adults that perhaps one of their children will get a higher education and be able to prosper. It's a hope that one of their children or more would rise up. But at the same time, if one of their children does rise to middle class or upper class, there's a certain skepticism that they would actually impose upon that successful child that, oh, so now you think you're better than us. There is things that maybe aren't conscious, but values that uh, sink deep into our nature because of how we were raised, the values we accepted by the people around us. Now, let's jump up to a middle class way of thinking, the values of the middle class. And again, I'm generalizing because there's so many different nuances because so many people have come with their own understandings from their own culture. But generally speaking, with middle class, the adults grow up thinking that they should get some kind of expertise, some extra training, and That would be wonderful if it was university training to qualify them for a career that will bring in more finances. Um, Most middle class people expect to purchase a home in their lifetime. They expect to pay it off at some time in their life. And some of them would expect perhaps to get a vacation home, take vacations during the year. The expectations of adults for their children are also more specific. We can think about middle class parents. They think it's their responsibility not just to house, clothe, and feed their children, but for clothes, the majority of their clothes they want to give as new clothes, purchased clothes for their children. They want their children to look nice and to feel good about themselves in relationship to all of their classmates, the other children that they associate with. Uh, Parents think that they're not just to meet the needs of feeding their children, but middle class people are much more attentive to wanting their children to desire the food that they eat, want them to have every meal being met. And they're not necessarily the thought of cleaning your plate, appreciate what you're eating. No, it's expected of parents to meet the children and have them enjoy life because rather than thinking life is hard, when you move into middle class, you accept values that are a little bit different. Life is a little bit better, and you expect it to be better. Um, Concerning education, in middle class, most of the parents do want their children to get some expertise training, maybe in a trade, but more normally a university, some higher education, not necessarily complete it, but they expect and hope their children do. In middle class, the parents take a big role in paying for their child's education. Now that's different from lower class. A lower class value system, parents think, well, if one of my child goes to university, well, they should work hard, apply for loans and grants. They expect that child to do more of the labor and pay for their own education. Where in middle class, the parents take on more responsibility. In fact, they often, right from birth, begin saving so their child will have a future higher education. Um, so when we talk about middle class, there is a higher value that life should have its blessings. Yes, there'll be challenges along the way, but adults expect that their career will always be there and they can even change careers throughout their life. And it's expected that they'll probably be in several different jobs, but there'll be an availability, short term breaks from transitioning from one job to another. But middle class adults expect that they'll be working. Sometimes it's one in a marriage, it's one spouse or the other, but usually sometimes in their marriage, they'll both have that experience. Now, jumping up to the upper class values and expectations, thought patterns, first of all, I should qualify that because although I have relationships with many people who are in the upper class, I would be misleading you to think that I actually am part of the upper class. So I'm talking from the perspective of people that I relate to, how I've had to learn different things in order to communicate effectively. And simply like you, I've experienced things, I've read books, okay? So understand I'm speaking from someone who raised in the lower class, but was blessed enough to be able to at least come into a more middle class. But now talking about the upper class, people who are more wealthy have accumulated wealth. The expectation, first of all, of adults, they expect that their university training, their expertise, somehow they've started their own business, they manage their own business, they're wise in investments, okay? They expect that they will be able to accumulate enough wealth during their working years so that it's no longer necessary to work. Now, they may choose to continue to work, but most people in the upper class arrive at a place where they make a choice whether to keep working or not because it's a need, but because they've arrived at a certain place where if they enjoy their profession, they will continue it. But because they arrive at a place where their house is paid for, they perhaps will buy a second house, maybe a vacation house. They expect to travel to other countries to experience other regions around the world. Um, they also develop a sense of privilege. And I don't say that in a negative way, but they honestly think that they are privileged to be part of the family in or the family lineage that they're a part of. Um, they acknowledge that the people they associate with are also privileged. And that's instilled an idea of that I belong to a privileged group. It's instilled within their own children. When we talk about adults raising children within the upper class, the parents just expect that they will pay for the university or whatever training that their children desire. But the education is not of the highest value. There's actually something more important within the upper class. It's the relationships that are developed while they go to university. It's the relationships they develop early on in their career that their children have relationships that will open up doors for them in the future, that they have relationships with other people in the upper class level, because what will actually most benefit them, their children, and their grandchildren, it's not just the education, but it's key relationships with other people who have influence. And upper class people think this way, that it's their relationships which are most important in allowing success and the accumulation of wealth in the future. Relationships. Um, Knowing that, you can kind of understand they put a much more high priority on seeking out relationships of influence, maintaining relationships of influence. And it even changes in their communication levels. Um, Being someone who's labored to come from lower class to upper to middle class, I've found through the years that sometimes in communicating with people of upper class levels that sometimes I say things that they don't understand why I said them because I've have a way of thinking and I've had to try to help myself communicate with them being more careful with my words. One little thing is, for example, the upper class are very careful to learn people's names and pronounce their names correctly. Coming from the lower class, people don't care so much about pronouncing your name correctly, or even uh, laboring to try get the right relationships. Uh, they want friends in low places because they're most comfortable with friends at your class level. Everyone is most comfortable relating to people within the class where they were raised. Now, there is a comfort level in continuing to relate to people within your own class, but there's shifting from one class to another is not just an issue of being comfortable. That's one element, but you actually have to change your thought patterns, your values to change from one class to another class because your values not only make you comfortable with people sharing the same values, but your values determine the outcome, the financial benefits that you live in. If you have low class values, those low class values and thought patterns produce a lower economic uh, rewards. If you have middle class values, those middle class values produce a life of middle class finances. If you have upper class values, those upper class values produce a lifestyle that matches, that corresponds with those values. Now, people off, especially in the lower class, don't like to admit that. And in fact, sometimes they don't even understand it. Um, they think, no, that you rise up maybe because someone just gave you a large amount of money. Maybe you rise up because you found some scheme, some get rich quick plan. There tends to be uh, ways of excusing people from the idea that I actually have to change my value system in order to rise up. Now, some people in the lower class may rise up to middle class because while they were thinking labor is the way I'm going to make a living, or servanthood, or unspecialized fields, um, perhaps they could come to a place within the lower class where they rise into management, start their own business. So, simply by thinking differently, they could rise into middle class by working hard and working with wisdom or getting some extra training. It's possible that way. But there also has to come a different way of thinking to remain successful within one of the different classes. Now, some people don't even like to talk about classes, they talk about a classless society. Um, so I'm not dealing with some future utopia. I'm talking about what life is, what we really live in. You know what? In the Western world, we truly do live with people who think differently. And you have to learn how to think differently to change your present economic system. It's not just a matter of working harder. That's a big issue. Yes, you should learn to work hard. Everyone should work to work hard. But there are different values that you have to change on how you think and how you act and how you speak to remain successful at a different level. Now, having just described that framework, because it is Western culture, just like in some of the developing nations, especially over in the Middle East and part of the Asian areas, they do have caste systems, part of that Asian area. Well, in the Western world, we do have classes. Okay, this is reality. No matter how much some people are taught that we shouldn't have classes, this is where you live. Okay, having explained that, I'd like to now turn our attention because we can ask the question, isn't there a higher standard that transcends classes? Aren't there principles that would apply to whether you're upper class, middle class, or lower class? And for that, I would orient our attention to a teaching Jesus gave. And it's recorded in Luke chapter 12. Jesus gives us a short parable of a farmer who had a huge crop, filled his barn, but then he has another huge crop, and he starts realizing he's becoming so prosperous he has to build mini barns. You probably have heard this parable, but maybe you've missed that after Jesus told the parable, he gave three things to consider, three considerations that every person accumulating wealth needs to take time to think about. Okay, so let me go to Luke chapter 12 and first read the short little parable Jesus says about this man who's accumulating wealth. Luke chapter 12, verse 16, he says, the land of a rich man was very productive. Okay, so that begins it. Now in verse 17, and he, talking about this rich man, began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for you for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, for this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, um, Jesus first tells about the man. He's now becoming prosperous. He's building barns. And Jesus is speaking to an agricultural society. 2,000 years ago, the people Jesus was speaking this to would have immediately related. They knew how farms worked. They knew people built barns. And when crops were good, people prosper, okay? Um, so after giving that short parable, Jesus gave three considerations. Okay, we're going to look at those three considerations. But first, I want you to bring this parable into modern day society, okay, into our world. so you can relate to it. So we're all talking on the same grounds. Jesus talks about a farmer. Now, I'm not so sure that I don't know how many farmers are listening to this talk on accumulating wealth. Probably the majority of you aren't. We all understand to some degree how this could work. But in order to bring it into the modern developing city dweller's life, I want to point out that you already have many places in your life where you can accumulate wealth. Figuratively, you already have many barns. So, because in the modern society, you have places where your wealth, they're already set up where you can deposit any extra money you have. You've got savings accounts, you've got access to everything a bank offers, but you've also got stocks, bonds, 401ks, investments, retirement plans. You could buy another home, you can buy land. There are an unlimited number of barns that you already have. In fact, figuratively speaking, the barns you have are unlimited, and you don't even have to build the barns. They already exist. And you don't even have to transfer your wealth to those. You can have auto withdrawals from your checking account, and you don't even have to know it. It can be happening without your own awareness. Plus, your money can go to somebody else who invests it for you. So I simply try to bring the lesson of Jesus into modern terminology so you can think you already have barns. Okay? We're thinking in different terms, but still, this lesson that Jesus gives is more applicable to you than it was 2,000 years ago. The barns are already built. You already can fill as many barns, and there are countless barns available to the average person who lives in a developed nation. So, having brought that into our life, we're going to look at the three considerations that Jesus then says to this man who has now accumulated enough where he can say, well done. This is what the man said. This is consideration number one. And Jesus is saying, this is what the man said. Now that I've accumulated all this, take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. This is consideration number one. There's a tendency, a temptation, that when people have accumulated enough, that they will take a different posture of life. The posture of life that Jesus is talking about here, where eat, drink, and be merry. For the rest of my life, I'm on vacation. I don't have to work anymore. Now, this is put by Jesus in the context of a warning. Now, that might surprise some people because rather than being a warning, this is actually the goal of many people who live in my culture. Many people work years and years and years so they can arrive at the place in their life where they will finally say, I have enough. Now I can finally rest. I can finally eat, drink, and be merry. I can check out. No longer do I have to struggle every day. Now I can take on a different posture of life. This is consideration. You need to think about this. This is what Jesus is saying. A person who accumulates wealth. Now, some people are successful and do it early in their age. It took me a long time. My wife and I struggled for years and years even to provide for our children. And I had to overcome a more poverty mindset. My wife was raised in a little bit different value, higher than mine. So she didn't struggle quite so much. One of the main changes that had to happen in my life is I had to shift from the concept life is hard and it should be hard to shifting to a more middle class that life should be blessed. It should have its blessings. Of course, there's going to be struggles. But being a Christian, I would want us to be aware of basing that understanding that life should not be so hard on fact. And what is the fact? What is the truth that should lift us from lower class to middle class? At the very foundation is your belief in who you think God is. Lower class people tend to think God is stingy. He's not generous, that he wants life to be hard. And through the years, my mind has dramatically shifted to a belief that God is a good God who wants to bless people. And there are all kinds of exceptions. There's
tragedies that happen to people. Life is complicated, but generally speaking, my understanding of the God revealed in the Bible has so dramatically changed through the years where I believe God wants to bless people. His plan for most of humanity is to bless them, yet life still has consequences. Behavior has consequences, okay? So even though God's plan is to bless people, uh, behavior not only of the individual, some people don't work hard, some people make bad decisions, but also behavior of governments influences whether people prosper or not. Behavior's consequences. So acknowledging that life happens, still God's generally speaking, God's a good God and he wants to bless people, I would say is the foundation that should help a person come out of poverty and into a more blessed lifestyle. At the foundation is your belief system, your concept of who God is. And that took quite some time for me to shift in my life, for me to learn that God does want to bless. Okay. Now, when I'm making this translation, now think. Consideration number one, when you start accumulating wealth, you come to a place where the posture of your life changes. This is the warning Jesus is giving. This is consideration number one. Previous to that reaching that place of I've accumulated enough, your posture of life was I need to be productive. I need to get out of bed every morning. Well, I want you to identify that as that is God's plan for humanity. From the very beginning of the Bible, after God creates Adam and Eve, he tells them, now be fruitful, multiply, and manage the earth. Okay, this is God's plan for humanity. Every human being on earth. God wants you to be fruitful, multiply, and manage the earth. Manage the things around you. This is why, this is what gives you purpose in life. You should live your life. And God even then told him, work 6 days a week and rest one. I don't propose that as a law. I'm simply saying, what was God's prescription for living a healthy lifestyle? God created you to work and work consistently, rest from time to time, enjoy life, but you are to be productive. When he says multiply and fill, yeah, he's talking about in part having children, but much more that multiply yourself and other people and multiply the blessings that you have and then manage things. Learn how not to just barely scrape by, but to get on top of the things that held you down. God doesn't want you to live as a victim. His plan in life is for you to be always progressing, advancing, moving ahead. Generally speaking, that's what God wants for every human being. He wants them to enjoy life, He wants them to be fruitful. Now, you can see that when God speaks specifically to his people, like in Old Testament times, he said, Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and through you, I'm going to bless every family on earth. God speaks to his Old Testament covenant people and says, I will make you the head, not the tail. Um, God does want to bless you. And if you have not been able to make that shift in your thinking, I would encourage you to read the materials, listen to the teachings of people who have made that shift. Because how you think manifests the life you live, what the belief system is. Now, first consideration, I'm trying to point out Jesus, what he's asking you, if you've accumulated wealth, there is a temptation set before you to change your lifestyle, to move off of the path of productivity and shift onto the path of now I can eat, drink, and enjoy life. Warning. Jesus is saying, watch out. Once you've accumulated enough, now there lies a temptation to change the posture of life away from the healthy way you were created to live as a productive, advancing person who's managing their life, getting on top of the difficulties, and you now shift to a place of passivity, victimized, or just selfishness. but even an attitude of entitlement. I've worked so hard, I deserve to live this way. Now, again, some people have never been taught this warning that when you accumulate wealth, this is what's going to come in your way, this opportunity to change the path of your life. I'll give you a couple examples of individuals who, to me, decided not to take that path and to remain productive. Um, because of our mission work, we've built quite a few schools in other nations. You know, there's two families that have significantly throughout the years, more than any other. There's lots of people who bless us. They send in little gifts and support us to help do what we do in other nations. But there's been two families that have uniquely invested in us. And I'm so grateful today for the years that they've helped us because I never could have accomplished what I did overseas without their help. But their lifestyles. You see, these two families that I'm referring to, both of them arrived at a place of accumulated wealth years ago where they could have taken on a different posture and just says, hey, we deserve a break. We're going to vacation the rest of our lives. We are going to go for the temptation that Jesus says, watch out for. And rather than take that path, both of them, even though they could have, both of them continued their businesses, deciding to actually continue allowing their businesses to continue producing because what they had decided that they should the rest of their lives not check out but become even more productive because they could accomplish more in the future than they had in all their previous years simply by continuing to be successful and taking what they build and invest it in things that they believe in. They made a decision to stay on the path of productivity rather than check out and say, no, I'm going to sit back. Now, in our Western culture, especially in developed nations, we have a time when retirement is expected. But retirement shouldn't be looked at as a time when you're going to say, now I have enough to retire so I can sit back and sleep in the morning and now I can finally rest, eat, drink, and be merry, okay? No, and I don't want to say everybody in retirement's doing that. I know some retired people are busier now than when they were working 50, 60 hours a week, okay? But there's a temptation that lies there. There's an alternative lifestyle that sometimes people move into, and Jesus is cautioning people, warning them, don't take that path. Don't slip over into there because that's not how you were created. That is contrary to the nature of God and the God in whose nature you have been created in. You've been created in his image and you have not been created as someone who's just going to live for yourself. God is a giver. He says, Abraham, I'm going to make you a blessing to every family on earth. That's the kind of spirit that comes out of God. That's the spirit of God that you should always allow to be at work in your life. Think of this alternative path when you check out like this man who now has enough barns filled. Not only is it a passive entitlement way of living, but it opened doors for temptations. You can't go down that path for very long before meaning and purpose diminishes and eventually disappears. People who take that path, it's only a matter of time till meaninglessness and purposelessness gets with them from the moment they wake up in the morning. That meaningless and purposelessness is an open door for temptations of all sorts. Because you're now choosing a lifestyle that was never God's plan for humanity, the things in the world, in 1 John, you read about the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life, the lust of the flesh, they're all there available to you. You see, when meaningless and purposelessness disappears, when there is no meaning or purpose, you need something. You will grope for something because you want to feel something. And sometimes that emptiness, people end up finding alcoholism, drug use, affairs. They're groping to feel something. And why is that? because they're not living the lifestyle they're created to live. They have now chosen a path of entitlement, passivity, thinking that, no, I've accumulated enough. Now, again, some people arrive very young. They're very successful, very prosperous. They can do it at a young age, but that's the temptation. Some people, like me, it took my wife and I, we struggled for years, and finally I turned 70. Like most of my friends right now, we're thinking about these things. That's primarily the reason I'm even talking about this issue, is because it's what I talk about with my friends. I wish everybody could hear some of these topics being discussed. Well, here is the temptation lying before you. And Jesus is saying, when you arrive at that point where you've accumulated for yourself, which is a good thing, God wants you to come to a place, but He doesn't want you to shift gears, take a different path. He wants you to stay living. And Paul writes to Timothy and says, those who are wealthy, teach them how to be generous and continue to produce, so that they might grasp a hold of what life is all about. Life is about not you checking out and now just you. Life is about accepting more and more responsibility, helping more and more people, becoming a blessing to not just you and your family, but the community and as many people as you can possibly be a blessing to. That's who God is. That's His nature. And He wants you to discover what life is truly about. Okay, I just gave you the first of three um, things to consider that Jesus gave when people start accumulating wealth. Let's go to number two. Number two, I go back to Luke chapter 12, where after describing this man who's now arrived at a place where he's accumulated enough wealth, he says, but God said to him, you fool, talking to this man who's now checked out and is only thinking about himself. He says, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? There's number two. Consideration number two. Now that you've accumulated this wealth, you know you can't take it with you. What's going to happen to the wealth that's left over when you're gone? This is consideration number two. Now, there's nothing wrong with accumulating wealth again. We're talking about the wisdom that God wants us to embrace once we're starting to accumulate wealth, okay? What's going to happen to the wealth? Now, it is wise, it is godly for you to accumulate enough, first of all, to take care of yourself. And if you have a spouse, your spouse. Perhaps you have someone dependent on you. Some people have a disabled person, someone who's sick that they have accepted responsibility. It is a godly thing to accumulate enough wealth to take care of them for the rest of their lives. That's a godly thing to do. Because you don't want to be a burden on your children or even on the government. You don't want to. That's not a righteous way of living, to just say, I'm going to become a burden. No, that's an irresponsible way of living. That's stepping back. That's choosing that path that we talk about, that no, I'm now passive and I'm entitled for someone else to take care of me. No, that's a wrong way of living. Just stop it. Don't think that way. Okay? But now you go beyond accumulating enough for yourself and your loved ones and people dependent on you, and you have to make a choice. There's still accumulated wealth. There's where we talk about inheritances and legacies. Now, I am going to set aside inheritance legacies for just a minute. We can refer to Proverbs, where Solomon, who's given credit for writing Proverbs, says the righteous person leaves an inheritance for his children and his children's children. Okay, I hope you've heard that proverb. Solomon was considered the most wise man in the world. Of course, we could put Jesus above that, but God specifically gave Solomon wisdom, godly wisdom, and he wrote Proverbs. So I'm going to build on that a little bit. Yes, we should leave an inheritance. Okay, how do we leave inheritance? What type of inheritance? But I want to come back to it. I want to add the third consideration, the third caution Jesus gives, because answering the third helps us answer the second. Okay, I want a complete picture here. So jump down to the third consideration. After Jesus tells about this man who's finally accumulating wealth, first consideration, don't check out. Don't become passive. Don't take on that lifestyle. That lifestyle that is a road to meaninglessness, purposelessness, living how God did not want you to live, giving up on being productive. Um, One more qualification, we know that we're all going to get old and feeble, and there will be a time when you can't be productive. But again, not talking about that. We're talking about people arriving at a place where they have enough, they could make a choice to take that path, and it's by choice. It's a bad choice. That's the consideration. That's the caution. That number one. Number two, what's going to happen to your wealth, all that you've accumulated after you die? And number three, Jesus says, in verse 21, so is the man who stores up treasure for himself is not rich toward God. Third consideration. Okay, he's making a comparison. Someone who stores up riches for himself, and it's put in contrast to being rich toward God. Now, this same comparison, this terminology, is used and expounded upon in another place Jesus is talking. And I'm just going to quote it, okay? You could go read it if you like. Many of you are aware that Jesus gave what's called the Sermon on the Mount. That's recorded in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. There's a few verses right in the middle of chapter 6 where Jesus says, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. Okay, now, first of all, that can be shocking. Jesus says, don't even do it. Don't store up for yourself treasures on earth. Okay, sometimes people have taken that without reading the context and decided, I'm not going to store up anything. Okay, that's not what Jesus is saying. No, in a minute, he's going to clarify. Okay, do not store up treasures. He makes a contrast and says, because where your treasure is, there will your heart be. Okay, don't store up treasure, because if it becomes your treasure, if all this accumulated wealth becomes your treasure, your heart will go there. Jesus didn't say it might go there. He says it will. You can't help it. If you have a large amount of accumulated wealth and now it becomes your treasure. You see, you can accumulate wealth without making it your treasure, without making it the thing that seizes your heart, without it becoming your love. Jesus then kind of brings it to the importance of this whole issue, saying you can only serve one master, God, or this treasure, your mammon, your money, your wealth. Your accumulated wealth becomes mammon when it becomes your heart. If you make it your treasure, you now have turned your heart away. You see, the issue is make God your treasure. Keep him your treasure. If you keep God your treasure, your heart will be on God. But if you, now that you've accumulated wealth, allow your heart to go to your treasure, shift, you will no longer be serving God. Wherever your heart goes, that's what you serve. There's other warnings about this in Scripture, like Paul talks when he writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 5. He warns that those who long for wealth, those who allow their heart to start pulling on it, getting fixated on it, that is where their heart goes. They fall into many foolish and harmful deceptions. You don't even realize it's happening to you, but your life starts going down a dark path, not even without you even knowing it, if you let your heart go that way. James warns about it in James chapter 5. The scriptures are clear that there's nothing wrong with wealth, but it's the love of money, the love when you turn your heart toward it and start loving it, and now you've made this money your treasure rather than God your treasure. In Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus says, okay, you can only serve one master or the other, he goes on and explains, don't be like the Gentiles who are greedily seeking for more and more wealth, or those who are worried constantly about their wealth. No, your heart is set on God, which protects you from worry and greed. What you really want is God. God, I want to serve you. When your heart is directed, when God is your treasure, you're going to serve God. Your heart, your life is going to continue going down that path. See, that's still part of this same picture where someone, rather than be a productive person because they want to be like God, because they have God's Spirit, they choose a victimized, entitled mindset, passive mindset. It's the same wrong course of life as when you put your heart on this accumulated wealth. What you want to do is live a life where God is your treasure. Therefore, you maintain a lifestyle of being created in His image as a productive person, helping other people, becoming a blessing not just to yourself and your family, but the community and the whole world. You want to maintain that. You discover what life really is about, pathing that path, okay? But you can still have this wealth over here. But if it's not your treasure, your thankfulness, your heart is toward God. God, thank you that you've allowed me to have this wealth, and I'm going to use it for your glory. Because what makes me most happy is doing what you created me to do. Okay? These are the three considerations that Jesus offers to people who are accumulating wealth. Watch out for these things. Think about it. Okay, we're going to go back now to number 2, which is what's going to happen to your accumulated wealth after you die. This brings in the concept of inheritances, legacy, those types of things. Now, I mentioned that Solomon, wisest man other than Jesus who ever lived, said, no, the righteous person leaves inheritance to their children's children. It is a good thing. Now, again, I was raised in lower class, and in the lower class mindset, you don't think much about inheritances. No, you think life is hard and it's probably going to be hard for your children. There isn't much thought given to it. And perhaps you're not going to use up all your money, so they'll end up getting whatever's left over. But in the lower class, it's a leftover mindset, which might happen or might not happen. There are exceptions, of course. But in the middle class, there is a thought, no, I want to leave something for my children. And the upper class, there is a very consciousness, no, I want my children to feel privileged. I want them to grow up with that sense, and I can help them cultivate that sense by letting them know they belong to a family lineage that passes on the legacy. Okay, so it's very important for the upper class, but isn't there a standard that supersedes all classes? That's why we're reading what the Bible says about it, okay? So, first of all, settle the issue. Solomon first said in Proverbs, yes, the righteous person leaves an inheritance, children's children. But now, before we jump on to the next part of that, a caution about that, put yourself back 2,000 years ago when Jesus talked, agricultural society. But Solomon lived 1,000 years before Jesus, so he was 3,000 years ago. That was even more of an agricultural society. So when Solomon wrote, inheritance should be passed on, that's a righteous thing to do. It's a good thing to do. What was he talking about? Now, they didn't have barns like we do today. They don't have 401ks. They don't have, insurance, life insurance, investments in stocks and bonds and all these other barns. Okay, that's not what was in Solomon's mind. 3,000 years ago, when Solomon wrote, "It's good for an inheritance to give." Well, I want to bring in one more verse that brings light to help us understand. I'm turning now to Ecclesiastes, but Solomon also wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 2, verse 21. This one verse is going to help us, and this is the last verse that we're bringing into our discussion today. Verse 21, when there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. Okay, now this is the other side of the coin. Okay, there's truth on both sides of the coin, as I speak figuratively. Yes, it's a righteous thing to leave inheritance to your children and grandchildren, but here he says, now, when there's a man who labored with wisdom and knowledge and skill, and it is to be expected. If you labor hard with wisdom and skill, you should expect to prosper, to accumulate wealth. This is the way life works. Of course, there's exceptions, but he says when this happens, when the natural course of life manifests, that people who work hard with wisdom and knowledge, they do accumulate wealth. But one who has not labored ends up receiving. Because you passed away, who did your wealth go to? It went to someone who didn't labor with you. This is vanity and a great evil. Vanity. What is vanity? That means this is foolish and doesn't accomplish anything good. To work hard, labor, accumulate wealth, and then let it go to someone who hasn't learned how to work is foolish and does not produce anything well. Step out of this now and let me give you a modern example. I'm going to give it from my life, okay? So for 35 years, I'm spending lots of time overseas, other nations, and doing missions work. Constantly, there's needs everywhere, and I want to help anybody who's desperate, who needs food. I want to do charity. Okay, that's part of it. But there's a higher thing that I'm really invested in. That is investing in people. But I've had to learn through these 35 years of working with people and investing in them in other nations, who should I invest in? And one thing I learned years ago that has profoundly directed my life is that I want to invest in someone who will do it with or without me. Think about that for a minute, okay? You see, all the time I come across people, and because ministry is my area, I find somebody who wants to do ministry. They say, I want to evangelize. I want to start a church. I want to help my nation. I want to start an orphanage. I want to do this. But they say it out their mouth, but they're waiting for someone to give them money before they do it. Okay? I have learned through the years of making mistakes that if I give that kind of person money, they've got a vision, they say they want to do it, but they're waiting for someone to give them money. If I give them money to do what they say they want to do, this is what typically happens. They will, yes, take the money and they'll start working. And they will advance. They will move in the direction they said they'll make some advancement in that. But in that, they'll build an infrastructure to facilitate the ministry. They might even take on some staff or maybe employees to help them with it. They'll start moving down that road. But what I discovered is that when I stop giving them money, they'll stop working. And after they stop working, they're in a worse place than they were before I gave them money. The reason they're in a worse place is because they used the money I gave them to build the infrastructure, to bring on a staff member, to hire somebody, or even more people, because they built up the infrastructure, and because they're now helping financially, maybe employees or staff. Now that the money's stopped, they've got employees and staff who are still looking to them, but now he can't give them anything because he didn't have anything, and the infrastructure, they can't maintain it, even though the infrastructure is still demanding money to be maintained. They now have a drain upon them financially, and they can't even meet that draining infrastructure. So now they're worse off than when before I gave them anything. And that's what the wisest man, Solomon, said, to leave a large accumulated wealth to somebody who hasn't learned how to work, okay? You learn how to work not waiting for money to come. So what I learned through the years is not to give money to somebody who's waiting for money. No, find somebody who's going to do it with or without you. They've got a vision. They have a drive within inside of them. And because ministry is my area, but this applies to all areas. Somebody wants to start a business, somebody who wants to, get an education, somebody wants to go into politics, okay, works for anything. Somebody who's going to do it with or without you. If you help somebody who's going to do it anyway, and you now invest in them, you will find that you are multiplying them. I mentioned earlier 2 families that have helped me through the years. They have empowered me to do 10 times what I would have done if I only had me without their help. Think about that for a minute. 10 times I've been able to accomplish because of them. That means if there was just one of me and without their help, only 1/10 would have been accomplished. So who accomplished the other 9 me's? They did. They accomplished more of what I do than I did. Okay, now I get the benefit of being the object through whom this happens, but guess what? I would have only been 1/10 without them. They made me more 10 times effective Well, guess who did it? It's actually they who were responsible for doing 9/10 of what I've accomplished in life. Who's God going to give the credit for? I mean, I'm grateful to God, but here are people who decided they could have sat back and become entitled and just take care of themselves. They could have chosen that path, but they decided to keep their business going because they realized, no, our business is the type of business where if we kept it going, we could accomplish a lot more by helping other people be successful, which they've helped many people, not just me, they've helped many people be successful. And I want to propose to you that what should you do with your accumulated wealth, okay? You can't take it with you. It is a godly, righteous thing to have enough accumulated so you don't become a burden. You want to have enough for the rest of your life and for your spouse and your loved one. I mean, that's a godly thing. You want to take responsibility. But even with your children, you see, if you have a child or a grandchild who wants an education, help them get the education. Invest in them. Now, as a purpose with a built in the low class society, I didn't have that value. I had to get my education and pay my own way and get a job because that was the I lived with that. Okay, I'm not regretting it or anything. I'm glad how I lived, but I've learned that I'm trying to find a value system that transcends class. Okay, I'm trying to find what's God's value system. Okay, here it is. When you give an inheritance, choose first of all, children and grandchildren are going to do it with or without you. If you have a child who wants to start a business, they're going to do it with or without you. Get behind them. Help them start the business. Help them hire some more employees. Help them with a marketing scheme. I mean, get behind them to help them. If you have a child who wants to build their own home or buy their own home, and they're going to do it with or without you, help them. Help them make it a nicer home than they were expecting. If you want a child who wants to get an education, they're going to study, help them get that education. If they're not going to study, don't help them. If they're sitting around waiting before they start their business, don't help them. You see what Solomon said? When there is a man who labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to someone who has not labored with them. Didn't learn how to work, but didn't labor with you. You see, why that's important is because in that culture, not just 2,000 years ago with Jesus, 3,000 years ago with Solomon, when they thought of inheritances, what was the number one thing that came to their mind? It was not stocks and bonds and investments. No, primarily it was the farm. It was an agricultural society. When you had a farm, the children worked with you. Number one, that's not to gate other inheritance that we have today, but I just want to say the context of what Solomon was saying in Proverbs and Ecclesiastic. What was first and foremost on the mind of inheritances at that time was, no, if your children worked with you, if your grandchildren worked with you on the farm, it's a godly, righteous thing for you to divide it up and let them have a piece of what you labored for. That's a blessing. But for you to give large amounts of money to someone who hasn't learned how to work, you see what that does? The consideration that Jesus gave to the man accumulating wealth. Remember consideration number one? There is a temptation to sit back when you got enough money to say, now I'm going to eat, drink, and just be happy. Just be merry for the rest of my life. To become passive, to become entitled, okay? That's a bad path. That's not the way God wants people to live. Okay, now if God wants you to consider not taking that path, He warns you about not taking that path, why would you put that path before your children or grandchildren? Why would you take one of your children who never learned how to work, give them a large amount of money? What have you just done? You've now put before them the temptation to sit back and say, now I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry, and now I'm entitled because I finally got my parents' inheritance. What's down that road? Meaningless purposelessness, which opens the door to alcoholism, drug use, affairs. It's not the lifestyle you can choose. I think we all know of people who have fallen for that lifestyle. I mean, in the news, there's people, famous people who've fallen for that lifestyle. Don't go that way yourself. Don't put that temptation between your children who haven't learned how to work. No, first they were talking about a farm. Now, let's take it up a notch because today you can have a business. If your children learned how to work with you in the business, which is a godly thing, it's an honor to have your children work with you. Some parents, that's their greatest desire. Well, then give them part of the business or break it up or give them the whole thing. Help them be successful if they've learned how to work. But go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 21. Okay, if you give it to someone who hasn't learned how to work and hasn't even worked with you, this is vanity. This is foolish and ends up causing destruction, corruption. But think of the last part of this verse. The sentence says, this is too is vanity and a great evil. It's a great evil to give large amounts of money to people who haven't learned how to work. Now, evil is evil, but this says great evil. Okay, when I see the word great attached to the word evil, I think of what's great evil? I think of things like murder, rape, genocides, kidnapping. There's things that are great, torture, great evil. Okay, well, I want to add one more great evil to the list. Giving large amounts of money to people who haven't learned how to work. That's a great evil. Don't do it. You're to consider never shifting from the productive lifestyle to a path of passivity and enlightenment. Don't do that to your children or grandchildren. No, you don't have to give and inherit. You're not obligated to give. And even worse is when someone who accumulates great wealth uses their wealth to hold in a treasure pot as a means of controlling their children and grandchildren. Do you see what you're doing if you do that? You let them know that you got a large amount of money, and maybe spoken or unspoken, but they're sitting around waiting for you to give it. Remember, I said when I'm helping somebody overseas, I never help someone who's sitting around waiting for money. Help somebody who's going to do it with or without me. But what you're doing is if you hold that treasure before them like a carrot on a stick to get them to do what you want to do, you are holding that treasure, which makes their heart get attached to the treasure, makes their heart look at money as the treasure. And that's the other warning Jesus said. Don't do that. Don't let your heart shift away from God to a treasure. Why would you make your children do that? Why would you hold a treasure in front of them which is pulling on their heart? And not only are you making their heart shift to that treasure, but you are manipulating them, controlling them. This too is a great evil. Looking for standards above class, lower class, middle class, upper class, looking for a standard from Jesus Christ, looking for standards from the wisest men in the world. Don't mess up people's lives. If you do have an inheritance, consideration number 2, Jesus says, consider where it's going to go. What's going to happen to the money that you leave behind? Don't just leave it for your descendants to fight over. Don't do that. Do you know how many families get destroyed because the parent or grandparent just left it and left the probate, left the judges to decide, left the children to fight over it? It's one of the most destructive things you can do to your descendants. Now, if you're going to leave something for someone, write it out very clearly, where it's going to go, direct it, and don't ever put it ahead as a carrot. Don't ever do that to manipulate your children to do something. Sometimes people think, well, I won't let them get it till they're 40 or 50 or something. Now, if they didn't learn how to work when they were 20, they're probably not going to be working when they're 50. Now, do it, first of all, during your lifetime. When you see your child is active, productive, help them, engage with them at that time. Give to them because that's when it's going to be most beneficial, because you want to multiply your child's productivity. You want to make them successful at it. If they want an education, help them, pay for their education. If they're not going to study, don't pay for their education. If they're not going to start a job, if they're not going to build a family and a home, don't hurt them. Don't hurt your children. We're looking for standards above that transcend class. We're looking for truth. Well, govern your life by that which is truth. Don't be as the foolish man who doesn't build his life on a rock. Build it on a rock. Build it on truth. Build it, what Jesus says, structure your life by what I say. He who follows what I say and builds his life accordingly is building their life on a rock. Finally, here we're at the end, toward the end of this time with you, but we have one more issue to deal with. You're accumulating wealth. You've helped your children. You've put away enough for yourself, for your loved ones, but you're now helping your children during your life, okay? Yeah, you might want to give some of your children some relief. Maybe they got a debt to take care of. Maybe, just out of love, you want to somehow help them do something, okay, that would actually benefit them. But you still have accumulated wealth left over, okay? What should you do with it? Well, you should do something you really believe in. Remember, purpose, meaning. I would like to introduce to you the person of Abraham. God chose Abraham and said, Abraham, I'm going to make you a blessing to every family on earth. Okay? Today, Abraham is considered the father of more of humanity than any other human being on earth. Okay, you could talk about Noah, but most people don't think of Noah, okay? But when we talk about the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, with almost 8 billion people in the world, way over half of that 8 billion all claim Abraham as their forefather. Christians, Abraham's our spiritual forefather. But for Jews and Muslims, that's who they consider. Abraham, God chose, I want you to be a blessing to every family on earth. This is what God wants. He wants the Abrahamic spirit. And guess what? That Abrahamic spirit came through Jesus Christ to all who believe in Jesus. The Abrahamic spirit, that you take on the nature of God and become a giver. Become someone in the earth who is a blessing to every family on earth. That's your goal. That's who you are. You want to find out what life is really about? It's not, okay, I've accumulated enough, so the rest of my life I'm vacationing, I'm taking care of myself. And you've just taken a path toward death. You pass on a legacy, give it to people who haven't learned how to work. Now you've put death on them. No, help them where they're productive. Help them where they're moving. Multiply them. But now choose things in life for which you can multiply. Invest in people who are doing things that really matter. Multiply what they're doing. I want to propose to you that there are a whole lot of Abrahams appearing, and in this new year, this is coming a time of prosperity where there's a whole nother mass of people who are going to be stepping into wealth. This is the year where there is a transfer of wealth, but I don't say that. I hate to use those words because some people hear transfer of wealth, they think, oh, we're just going to passively be here while God shifts it from the unrighteous to the righteous. Okay, no, that's not. So that's why I don't like to use the transfer of wealth. No, people who have allowed themselves to live as God wants them to live, who have chosen a productive lifestyle, there's going to be a shift of wealth into their hands. People who are going to do it with or without help. People who are have that energy, that productivity, who have the spirit of Abraham to say, I am going to be a blessing to every family on earth. People who have the spirit of Jesus to literally walk out becoming a blessing to every family on earth, who literally are givers. God so loved that he gave his son. People who have that spirit, that's who's getting the wealth. That's where it's going to drift toward. That's where it's going to move toward, because God can trust them. And it's not just a few people that we're hearing about in the news who have redirected their lives this way. There will be millions of people that are going to become and filled with the Abrahamic spirit. The Abrahamic spirit, which just says, no, I want my life to be like Abraham's, where yes, I'm prosperous enough where my children and descendants are blessed, but guess what? I want to be a blessing to every family on earth. You need to empty some of your barns. That's what we're talking about. Don't make your barns your treasure. They're just things. God's your treasure. You need to consider where your wealth is going to go after you die. These are the three things. People who accumulate wealth, consider that you don't fall into the passivity, enlightened, entitled role. Don't make your wealth your treasure. Keep your heart on God. You need to consider now where your wealth is going to go. You need to direct those barns, and some of you need to empty some of your barns as soon as you find the right places where you want to invest in things that you believe in. The Abraham's spirit. God promised it years ago that Abraham would be a blessing to every family on earth. It's not happening just because of Abraham. It's because the spirit of Abraham also, that spirit of giving, that spirit of I exist to be a blessing to every family on earth, is going to come upon millions of people. We are coming into a different dimension of economics for the world. There's a way of handling economics that transcends class. Be wise, be blessed, but I finally speak the blessings of God on you. Become what you're created to be. Never back down. Don't be intimidated. Be courageous. Be bold. Be decisive. Do in the earth what you're called to do. Thanks for listening. God bless you. Prosper.